This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Ramsey Campbell, the horror novelist and cinephile. He's written several books on cinema, a book of reviews called Ramsey's Rambles, and also a book about the Three Stooges called Six Stooges and Counting. So we discussed those as well as general things about writing on film, and it's a really startling's the wrong word, but it's a great conversation. It's really a lot of fun. It was a great opportunity to talk to a writer who I'm a great fan of, and I hope you enjoy the conversation, as I'm sure you will. And if you do, please remember to let everybody know about it. The audience is getting bigger every week, and it's only a matter of time before this becomes a global sensation. So thanks ever so much for listening and for helping out with that. But before you do any of that stuff, please enjoy the conversation.
No, my first film, good Lord, I think I was probably 3 years, maybe 4 years old. It was the Disney Snow White. And I was deeply disturbed by it, by a couple of scenes in particular, one of which is the magic mirror. I think it was partly the notion of looking in a mirror and seeing something other than yourself that I found genuinely disturbing. It wasn't until years later in my naughty adulthood, when I discovered that psychedelics do precisely that to you, that perhaps I understood what was really so disturbing about it. And there's another, I mean, obviously the scenes that are meant to be frightening frightened me as well. But there was one that was not supposed to be frightening that possibly got to be worst of all, and that's what in theory is the light relief. It's the dwarf's song and dance to Snow White, which kind of gives us a break before the traumatic finale of the film, and all that I could see, not all that I could see, but what preoccupied me was that in the background of many shots, there was a window with presumably no glass in it and only darkness filling it, so presumably looking out onto the forest. And I was terrified that something would appear out of that darkness, which you may say is why I write what I write and have done so ever since pretty well. So that's always stayed with me. I mean, other early experiences, there was Limelight, which I went to see with my mother and her mother, and they wept copiously throughout, which I found deeply embarrassing. I saw a very minor John Ford movie, Mogambo, and the only thing I really recall about this, well, famously, Lindsay Anderson in his review, because he was a great admirer of John Ford, but about all that he could find to say that was really positive was the shots of the gorillas must have been difficult to obtain, which is probably why I don't remember a great deal. It's a sort of jungle adventure. But what I do remember, again, I saw these, and I'm sorry, these cinemas are after your time, but nevertheless, they were big Liverpool cinemas. There was an Abbey, which was then just a big single screen place that later became the Abbey Cinerama, but in the early 50s, it was just a big screen. And there were two boys sitting just behind me and my mother, and I heard one whisper to the other, "You're going to see him shot, and then you'll see all blood." And again, I was very, very taken aback by this, and spent the entire film basically in a state of panic and apprehension, waiting for, and eventually there is a polite dab of red to signify, which is all you're going to get. We're not talking Peckinpah by here, obviously. We're talking, early 50s John Ford. Early 50s Anthony Mann might have been a bit more graphic when I think about it, but no, this was polite in the in the most John Ford fashion. And another film, clearly many of my memories are of being terrified by film. The first, well, I mean, it wasn't a horror movie, but technically the first monster film that I ever saw, by now I'm 10, and it is This Island Earth, which I still love, actually. I mean, it's not the greatest science fiction we ever saw, but, it certainly has some conviction. And the best scenes, which is the last, I think, about the last reel, apparently directed by Jack Arnold, uncredited, so who obviously knew what he was doing in terms of science fiction and horror. And it's when we get to the mutant, which is a really pretty impressive mutant. Then again, I was very, very frightened. Now, as I recall, the film had a U certificate, so the mutant doesn't do anything very much except shamble around and be menacing. But nonetheless, for me, it did it. There is one final instance, and this traumatized me so much that I actually had to incorporate it in a novel later on. It's a not very good, in fact, not very good at all, Danny Kaye attempt to do, I suppose, a Hitchcockian thriller called Knock on Wood, in which Kaye is a ventriloquist, and his doll is used by I think the member of the good spy organisation to secrete a microfilm to get it through customs into England. There's also, the bad spy organisation, which is after the microfilm. The two representatives of two of these organisations end up in Kaye's flat while he's out, and one of them chucks a knife at the other, pinning him to the back of a door. Kaye then immediately returns, and the gag is obviously, how long does it take me to realise it's not a coat on the back of the door, but a corpse with a hat over its face, or that's on the back of its head, actually. And around me, everybody was laughing. And this made it 10 times worse because, I was absolutely terrified by it. And it seemed to me this scene went on, for hours at the very least. It doesn't. Actually, it's very perfunctory. I mean, it doesn't even milk the gag. But nevertheless, the idea of something on the back of the door, which turns out not to be just a coat, stayed with me for so long that I actually incorporated it in a novel called The Nameless, several decades later. So, there's my first thank you to movies.
Direct inspiration.
Absolutely.
It's so interesting how, as a kid, your mind sort of... I always remember being told about a scene in one of the Omen movies, it might be the first one or the second one, where everyone at school told us about this scene where the lift goes down and a man is cut in half by the cable.
Yes.
And I couldn't imagine. I was like, this is unbelievable. I can't. How would they do it? How could you even see something like that? And then when I finally saw it, I realized I'd been thinking he was being cut down the middle from vertically, where of course he's being cut across the waist, but still a very gruesome scene.
Damn right. Well, listen, I can match that story of yours because not a movie exactly, although it became one. When I think I was 9 or 10 at school, and we didn't have a television in those days, but it wasn't until quite a lot later that we got a television. And folk were coming in, my classmates, and they were talking about this scene in which the monsters push somebody up a pipe and all blood comes out, and they've stuffed him in and mashed him up, and so he stoppers the pipe. Now I thought they're making this up. Nobody could ever do such a scene ever. And then some years later I saw the film of Quatermass 2, and by God, I thought, good Lord, there it is. Now, it's fair to point out that Nigel Neal would not have approved at all. Well, he was an acerbical guy anyway, in all sorts of different ways. But he didn't approve of children being allowed to watch the Quatermass films. And I didn't then, but my peers certainly did.
Yeah, and you were sort of chomping at the bit to get into those ex-certificate films as well.
Oh, yes, Lord, yes. Because, of course, in those days, nearly every horror movie had an X certificate, which meant that you had to be, or at least to seem to be, 16-year-old at least in order to get in. Well, came 14, and I thought maybe I could bluff my way. And, some cinemas were not that concerned anyway, probably because they were on, to some extent, their last legs. So they were letting people in who seemed reasonably persuasive. And so I did certainly get in. But for years, you see, I've been reading Forry Ackerman's famous Monsters of Filmland and seeing all all these images that I yearned to catch up with. The only problem with this was that, since the magazine would do extended appreciations of things such as the Lugosi Dracula, the Karloff Frankenstein, by the time I saw these films, I knew all the high points. I could have virtually quoted you all of Lugosi's famous lines from Dracula, and it wasn't quite the same. And it actually wasn't until, because they just seemed to me to be aged by then, they muffled actually. They didn't reach me. And it wasn't until we got to the Blu-ray restorations, and it was as if I was seeing them for the first time, at the premiere, that all of a sudden I thought, by God, yes, these still do have it, and of course they do.
Good, and that Blu-ray box set of Universal Monsters has got to be one of the best value for money buys.
Very much so. Well, in fact, we've upgraded to the ultra high definition, and that some of that is quite jaw-dropping. I mean, in particular, the Spanish Dracula looks like it's never been near a projector before. Well, obviously they've gone back to the negative, but it is. I mean, I just think these developments in film restoration are absolutely crucial, and I'm glad to be alive while they're happening.
It's so interesting as well, I think, this connection between literature and books and films, because for me, it's always been rock and Rolling Stones and Beatles. I like both, and I like literature, I like cinema equally. But because I grew up in an age where cinema wasn't available or accessible, or it was, but in a staggered way. I couldn't get in to see Blade Runner. I wanted to see Blade Runner, but I was too young. It was 1982. Yeah. I was 10 years old, and it was an A, I think.
Yeah, it was 15 or double A. Yeah,
yeah, double A.
15 certainly. Yeah, whatever it would have been at that time.
So I read, at 10 years old, I read Philip K. Dick's novel.
Because
it came out as a film tie-in, and I became obsessed with him. So it sort of fed into, it got me into reading this sort of book, and then I would read a book and they'd make a film out of it, and I'd go and see that film. And so there was always this relationship, which is always very symbiotic to me.
Yes, I know what you mean, sure enough.
Did you have that relationship in terms of your creativity, in terms of your writing?
Not in that sense, no. I mean, there have been films that have influenced the writing, but not. The cinema is not a primary influence. I have written novels about film, certainly. I mean, a couple. I had great fun doing a novel about a lost Karloff and Lugosi film, a novel called Ancient Images, which I thought it didn't quite make it. I thought it's a little bit sort of patched together. The two themes of the book don't quite cohere, I don't think. So I had another go about a silent comedian in a novel called The Grin of the Dark. But I mean, in terms of actual films that have influenced my writing, well, actually, oddly enough, the very first subtitled movie I ever saw, well, it just did all sorts of things profoundly to me. I was 14, I think, then, or if not, I just turned 15. And I'd gone to see Bert Eigorn's The Cyclops, which is, a standard monster movie of the atomic radiation era, in which this guy, for no very good reason, but apparently that's what radiation does to you, is irradiated, and not only does he grow about 40 feet tall, but his scalp falls over one eye, so he becomes the Cyclops. Hence the title. And he pops up from roundabout, and he is quite scary for a 15-year-old who hasn't seen many horror films. But on with this was a film, and it started, and I thought, what the hell's that? What's that writing along the bottom of the screen? What am I supposed to do now? Do I read that, or do I look at the film? What do I do? And it took me a little while to, as it will, I think for most people, and for never, I suppose, for some people, but, it took me a little while to get into it. But I think it was about, 10, 15 minutes in. And again, in terms of the sort of thing we were talking about before, the Quatermass Mouse 2 business, the Omen and so forth. But I was sitting there thinking, am I really seeing this on a screen? This is going further than I thought cinema could possibly go. And this was Buñuel's Los Olvidados, which theoretically is a near-realist film about street gangs in Mexico City. But it seems to me he pushes it so far that we're really back to Buñuel the surrealist, in terms of some of the imagery. And there's a dream sequence in the middle, which is not particularly signals as one. All of a sudden, as in Tristana, suddenly we're in a dream, and it's very simple. There's no technical trickery. It's basically our young, well, I would hardly say hero, but protagonist, who is, I think, pre-teenage, and the older leader of the gang fighting for a side of beef under his mother's bed. And, well, you riddle that as you will. But, again, I found this just deeply disturbing. And the whole thing of, using surrealism and dream to illuminate reality and in terms of social comment, that certainly pointed me in a direction that I was going to follow. And I suppose the other film which I saw a couple of years later, another film I love, and incidentally, isn't it time we had a Blu-ray of Los Olvidados? But I hear rumours of an ultra-high definition restoration, so perhaps it's not far off.
I saw a print of it in Cannes about 3 or 4 years ago, so there is definitely a restoration in existence already.
Good to hear. I mean, I've got a basic DVD of it. I could, do with an upgrade, certainly, as I'm sure could everybody. The other film that actually did influence the way I do it, and again, one of my absolute favourites is Last Year in Marienbad. I think I was just about 17 when I saw that. And the way that René kind of explodes time, shatters time, and leaves you adrift in it, basically, gives you no indication of how is the following shot going to be, a year later, a year earlier? Does it happen at all? I loved that. I always will, and that again directed me to some extent to the sort of things that I want to do with my fiction.
Yeah, that complete revolution where I think there's a shock when you watch that film. The shock of the new. The shock of the possible,
Absolutely, yes, yeah. Very much so. And yet, of course, it's almost been subsumed into mainstream cinema, what he was doing by now. It's extraordinary. But still, to me, as what you say, if you go back and look at the original, it still has an astonishing potency. And so does Muriel, actually, which is his following film. And I saw that at the JC in Liverpool, long gone now, which was, it was a sort of slightly risque cinema that ran, Swedish call girls and stuff like that. But every so often it would do a Franju or a René or a Francesco Rossi, and they ran Muriel for a week. And, I loved Marienbad so much. I went as soon as they opened with Muriel one afternoon, whatever day, I think Sunday they used to open the week those days. And I 2 hours later, I stumbled out of the cinema with no idea what on earth I'd been watching. I genuinely didn't know, but it haunted me. So a couple of days later, I went back and saw it again. And this time I began to grasp it. There was certainly, more, I took more away from it. So I went a third time, same week. And the third time, I got it. And again, I've loved that ever since.
Yeah, it's that great experience of having, of sort of learning. I love repeat visits to the cinema. I think there's a real. I was talking to a critic earlier this year, and he was saying he'd just been to see Furiosa, and he was going to see it again, but the only viewing available was in French. And he didn't know French. And he went, it doesn't matter. I'm going to go and watch it because I want to concentrate on the visuals anyway. And I just thought, that's an interesting thing. Well, not to worry about it. Just go and experience it anyway. The other film that you mentioned in the book, which you say you almost sort of like hold up as for many years as your standard by which you judged other films, was Night of the Demon.
Oh yes, absolutely, yes. My all-time favorite horror movie, that still is, and that was one of the very first that I saw. Now, here's the thing: I was saying before that virtually every horror film had an X, including, for instance, Plan 9 from Outer Space. That was not suitable for under 16s, apparently. Well, there you go. I don't know what to make of that, but there you go. The thing was that once I started getting into X movies, I wanted an X for my money. I wanted a reason for it to have an X. And if I went to see, some of the Lugosi monograms of the 40s, I came out thinking, Why? Basically, because they've got a PG now, or even a U, possibly in some cases. I don't know. But so what I wanted terror. That would get me. That would certainly satisfy me. Horror actually has, in some, what were then the gruesomeness of the Hammer movies, or Circus of Horrors, that kind of thing. There was a whole spate of at that time. But atmosphere would certainly do it for me as well. If it was very atmospheric, then yes, okay, that was fine with me. Well, actually, Night of the Demon delivered it on all three fronts. It seemed to be terror, certainly, atmosphere, wonderfully, and there is real horror in it, though. I think, I'll have nothing said against the demon himself, because I actually think he's a pretty good thing. I mean, I know Jacques Tourneur, or Jake's Turner, depending on what you want to say, expressed his doubts, but I think it does really work in the context. I do think those scenes are very powerful. Also, I mean, well, I could sit here and talk all day. In fact, I did do an extra on the Indicator Blu-ray of Night of the Demon, raving about how much I love it. But one thing I will say, which I think is worth saying, is that Neil McGuinness is one of the great performances of British cinema. I think it's possibly the single most nuanced villain in cinema that I can think of. Extraordinary performance. So I've seen the film again and again and again. I don't know, several dozen times. My wife loves it too. And every time there's something new, and I find it inexhaustible. But then again, I find Plan 9 inexhaustible too. So I'll have nothing said against that either.
I won't say anything against it.
No.
I mean, I'm interested in what you said as well about the monster, because I kind of love all those reveals. And when, I'm someone who I genuinely don't get why people complain about the shark in Jaws. I don't. It terrifies me. It looks like a shark to me. I don't know.
No, it does.
What more do you want?
I feel maybe some people have been closer than that and find it not quite convincing. But of those of us who haven't, then it certainly does it for me.
And it's paced in such a way that when it finally arrives, I think you have to finally show it. You have to have that.
Yes. Oh, you've got to do it. Yeah, that's right. But you see, I mean, here's a sort of an old favourite, really, in some ways. And that's a Roger Corman movie, Attack of the Crab Monsters. Now, okay, the monsters in that are pretty perfunctory, and yet there's something about the whole film, there's sort of dreamlike, almost nightmare quality to it. This whole notion of the island shrinking around them, and really rather a good script by Charles Griffith. And Corman again knows enough not to show his monsters, too directly, or he'll try to give you just a glimpse, or a couple of seconds. They're not on the screen for long enough for you to point and laugh in the way that maybe some of the other monsters of the 50s certainly were. The giant claw, again, by gum, there's a film to conjure with, and a monster to conjure with for sure.
But sometimes it's a very cheapness of a film which makes you, which has that effect. I mean, I would throw in Texas Chainsaw Massacre and also Deodati's Cannibal Holocaust as two films which are so grungy, and that adds to the aesthetic. That makes it looks like maybe they just killed people to make this.
Well, that was the rumor, but I think he managed to produce his actors and get out of a jail sentence, apparently.
Yeah, there was a court case in Milan. Because I think the advertising was this film could only be made where life is cheap.
That might have been it. Yes, that wouldn't help, would it?
But he managed to demonstrate with the special effects. I think especially that one that's on the poster of somebody who's been impaled.
Yes, that's right. Very
significant. I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about the book, the other book that you sent me, Six Stooges and Counting.
Indeed, yes, indeed.
Now, I really was interested in this book because I'm very much a Laurel and Hardy, Buster Keaton, Chaplin sort of guy.
Well,
And
so am I actually. Let me say that at once. I'll have
right.
nothing, I mean, I think Laurel and Hardy are the greatest in terms of comedy teams. Again, they just get richer and richer, their best films, and there are a lot of them. I don't know if you've seen the recent 1927 box set collection of their films, which is, got some restorations of films we've not actually were thought to have been lost, and certainly longer versions of films that we did know. But yeah, I mean, I love Laurel and Hardy, Keaton, yes, Chaplin, yes, Harold Lloyd. I'm very fond of. So, but yes, carry on. Sorry.
No, no, the American comedy teams like the Three Stooges and
Mhm.
late Abbott and Costello, who you mentioned in the
Mm,
book, they get a
mm.
mention in David Thompson's biographical dictionary of film.
That's right.
Um,
Abbott and Costello do. The Three Stooges do not.
right. See, Abbott Costello, I've never found funny.
No, not
Um,
really me. No.
and I wonder if it's just the gap, the cultural gap is too big.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
the Three Stooges, I have found funny. I've definitely
Aha.
found funny, but I haven't watched as many. They've just not been as um, present on television, I guess, or present,
No, not recently. No. Well,
Mm.
this was it. You see, I really, well, yes, I did first encounter them when Channel 4 started up in Britain, when it was, supposedly, well, not supposedly, definitely was an alternative channel, and it was trying to do things that the other channels were not doing. And one of these apparently was to show Three Stooges films that nobody else was doing, and so these would show up, I think, several days a week in the early afternoon, 20 to 2 they would be. And I found myself, trying to make time to watch them. But the thing was, I didn't find them funny. There was something that kind of made me sufficiently interested to come back and have a look at another one. But, I don't recall laughing very much at all. I think I'm also right in saying these were just the Curly era short films. They were the short films, certainly. And after that, well, they came to an end, and after that, I didn't see anything of their work for quite a few years. Then came, I mean, some splendid person at Sony in America, obviously, well, one assumes a fan, or if not, certainly a very serious restorer, decided to issue all the short films chronologically in slipcased sets, so about several years per set. And I just recall finding them sufficiently interesting to have another look. And so I ran through these again, and I began to think, well, yeah, there is something more here. It was not really until I was asked by Neil Snowden over at Electric Dreamhouse, who were the publishers of both these books, actually, the film book end of PS Publishing, if I would do well, initially he wanted me to do a monograph because they had been doing a whole series of very good monographs on any number of different films. I mean, my original choice was, I think, Night of the Demon, but somebody had already done that. And Lost Highway, I think somebody was already doing that. But also, I did begin to think, well, could I really write 20,000 words on a single film? And it then occurred to me, well, perhaps the career of a performer or possibly a team. And I think it was at this point the Stooges began to nag at my consciousness. I thought maybe initially my idea was to do Snow White and the Three Stooges as being, because generally speaking, the films in that dealt with in this series have some fantastic element. But then the more I thought about it, the more I thought no, because for a start, that's a film of interest, but it doesn't star neither the original team nor, well, technically speaking, the original team is Shemp and Mo and Larry. Then the one that most people know is Curly, Mo and Larry. Then Shemp comes back, but after that, of course, there are substitutes. And by the time we get to Snow White, we've got the final substitute. So I didn't think that was justified, even in terms of putting it into the context of everything else. And so the book ultimately becomes what you have, which is an overview of, well, basically their entire career and everything I could possibly watch, I did. And I mean, this has been an ongoing project, I don't know, for several years, because every time I thought it's finished, I then would think, no, hang on, I would find something else online, or somebody would have, discovered what was thought to be a completely lost Stooges movie. And I'd have to, interpolate that into the document, and I was still whittling away as we went to production. And dare I say this now, because I hope that not too many people are going to be outraged by this. We've now done a second printing, which is the one which I think you have, John, and the one that is now on sale, and I've expanded that quite considerably, not least making far more of the undoubted fact that The Shining is an extended Three Stooges tribute.
This is what I wanted to talk about, because that's exactly, yes, you talk about how Jack Torrance types like one of the Three Stooges. How
he does.
He threatens Wendy in a way that Moe would threaten.
Well, give me the bat, Wendy, give me the bat. And of course, he eventually bonk, Well, that's absolutely Moe and Curly.
He falling down the stairs, and
yes, that's right.
There's even a little bit of slapstick because he gets a drink spilled on him by the
exactly that's right, by Grady. That's right, the caretaker. There's always been the caretaker. No, he hasn't. He's always been whatever he has been. No, Jack is now the caretaker, and he's always been it. But yes, no, I mean, you see, you're certainly aware of the film Room 237,
absolutely,
which is a series of extended analyses of The Shining, the Kubrick film, in terms of a particular thesis. So that in one argument is, well, it's not my argument, most certainly, but that the entire film is his confession that he faked the moon landing. Now, no, the Three Stooges are what it's all about. And I'll go to my grave saying so.
I think we've all got to have a hill to die on when it comes to The Shining.
I think so.
My thing is, it's all about snow.
Yes, absolutely.
It's just an excuse to see how light reflects off snow.
Indeed.
What do you think of The Shining generally as a film, as an example of also as an example of adaptation?
And there you are again. There you are again.
Sorry.
Now, did you get all that?
I think I might have done. I didn't hear some of it, but I think the recording will have picked it up, because it's
to freeze before eyes and turn to just like Jack Torrance. That's what's happened.
There, it was a tribute. It was my tribute to The Shining.
Well done.
What I might do is, if there's any more problems with the connectivity here, I'll take off my video so that it's it narrows, that it makes more one bandwidth.
I know.
So we were talking about. I mean, one other thing I want to say about the Stooges, which I think they don't get maybe enough credit, is how wonderful they are when it comes to lampooning Hitler.
Oh yes.
And that's one of my favorite of the few Stooges films I've seen.
It was most favorite of all the films, in fact.
Right, you Nazi spy.
That's the one.
Yeah, I thought that was. I mean, you make the point in the book. You think he's better at mimicking Hitler than Charlie Chaplin in The Great Dictator, which again is a hill to die on.
Well, yes, I think it's fair to point out, that Chaplin is very funny. Possibly those nonsense speeches do go on a bit in The Great Dictator, but he's got 2 hours to play with, where the Stooges habitually have about 20 minutes to play with. But I think that what comes out of Moe is all of a sudden there's this real venom, behind his portrayal. There's a certain manic quality which Chaplin doesn't try for, but he doesn't. So he's not wanting to do that. But I think you can sense beneath it, Moe's loathing of what he is lampooning, Jewish vulgarisms that creep into the Yiddish in which he uses.
Yeah, I mean it is because the Stooges are kind of well known for their violence and their fights.
They are.
That's the kind of I don't know, that is that their signature move.
Well, no, I don't think it is. There's certainly a lot of it, and at times it gets very violent without doubt. But then on the other hand, there is a lot of slapstick in Laurel and Hardy, for instance. And I think the
True.
Stooges also have got, there's a lot of verbal humour in their stuff. And the thing is that the things go by so fast that you may not get them all first time round, which is why I came increasingly to like their work when I began to listen as well as watch.
And that verbal dexterity is really played out in the titles. I loved reading your sort of dedicated sort of mini chapter on the titles
Mm,
alone,
mm,
where what's the matador, and
yeah,
it just went
yeah.
on, and I was kind of giggling as I went through the whole
Indeed,
lot.
indeed, yes, yes, I like this, and also they actually they didn't overplay it any more than Laurel and Hardy did, but you quite often will get a little song and dance routine thrown in. Oh, I mean, in fact, I say thrown in, it's nearly always narratively germane. It's actually there for a reason, but they'll often do one, but it'll seldom last more than a minute because again, so much as the pace of the Stooges at their best is one of the things I think is very striking about them.
I always say it's a funny thing that in those sort of silent comedies and those 20-minute shorts, I think this is true of all of the people in that early sound era. Um, is that sort of sense of there always being a sort of empty pause after the
Mm,
gag,
mm.
so that if you're in a cinema, that's when the audience are laughing. But if you're
Yes.
watching it at home, it feels like, why is it just stopped
Yeah.
there? Why is the film just stopped and then it starts
Yes, yes,
again?
I know what you mean. Well, the students in the main don't pause. They just keep throwing it at you and at each other, obviously. So I suppose that does distinguish them to some extent.
Mm, mm. And when you look at Laurel and
Mhm.
Hardy, is there a sense that you wouldn't write on Laurel and Hardy because you'd be thinking, well, it's all been done, whereas the Stooges are somewhat
There was a
neglected?
bit of that, certainly. I mean, I grew up with the Charles Barr monograph that movie published on Laurel and Hardy. And there are
Mm.
other very good ones. But no, I guess I could write about them. Maybe I should. But if that's going to be another huge ongoing project, I think. Do I still have the vigor? Well, let's find out.
I think it's great the number of sort of modern the sort of legacy that you detect in films as different as like Sammo Hung's Jackie Chan
Mm,
movies, for
mm.
instance. And also Sam Raimi's Evil Dead,
Yes.
you say is highly influenced
Oh
by them.
gosh, yes. Well, I mean, he does acknowledge that, doesn't he? In the famous final credit for fake Shemps, which for those who don't know, basically the point was that Shemp died in the 50s, but because half a dozen of their films have been partially completed, the studio Columbia elected to use a stand-in so that they could be completed. So you've basically got a chap called Joe Palmer with his back to the camera, or in one moment, very reminiscent indeed of Plan 9, possibly prefiguring Plan 9, actually walks past the camera, shielding his face with his arm. And that's hence the fake Shemp. But equally, oh brother, where art thou? I don't think there's any question that there are elements of the Stooges in that. And I think I might say that Joel Cohen admits to it in an interview somewhere. More to the point, the film that the chain gang goes to watch in the cinema at one point in Oh Brother, that's a Stooges film. It's a movie called Mert
Mm.
and Marge. Well, admittedly, they only have cameos in it, but it is certainly a Stooges. And you actually see Ted Healy, whose Stooges they then were. You do see him in the footage that we see on screen. I think that's too definite a nudge to the audience to be accidental.
And it is like the only that I can think of right off the top of my head, the only sort of trio that we have in cinema of that kind of
Well,
comedy.
there is the Ritz brothers, but frankly, I think they're a long way
Right,
behind, I'm afraid.
right. And that's an interesting combination.
Mm,
That's an
mm.
interesting, we in later British TV we'd have what? I mean, the Goodies were a trio, I
Yes, that's
guess.
true. That's certainly true.
Thinking about also about your day job, if you
Mm.
like, as a as a horror
Indeed.
novelist. Do you find sort of comedy and horror have similar? I mean, you've already talked about the Danny Kaye comedy giving you direct inspiration for one of the,
Mhm.
I have a friend who is very interested academically in horror, and he always refers to any bit of business as a gag.
Ah,
He says, "Oh,
yes.
that's a great gag in,
Mm, mm.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre when this
Yes.
happens."
That's interesting because I certainly refer to gags in my stuff, although not so much in terms of the overt horror as actual gags. I think there's a pretty strong comic element in some of my stuff, and has been for quite a time. But I don't separate it. I mean, it's not a matter of comic relief. It's they're far more intermingled or interdependent actually. And I mean, I tend to the term that I've come to think of as applying to a lot of my stuff is comedy of paranoia, or in fact,
Mm.
nightmare comedy, I used to say, but comedy of paranoia perhaps even more so. And one thing I found very interesting earlier this year, a film I feel enormous affinity with and very much like, I've seen it a couple of times, and shall see it again soon. It's Beau is Afraid. Um, which
Mm.
Scorsese described, Martin Scorsese, as a 3 hour panic attack, which I think is a pretty decent definition of it, certainly. But I was interested to see that Ari Aster, in an interview, actually described it as a nightmare comedy. And well, by gum, I think he's right. And I think the first 20 minutes, the scenes of the city at the beginning in particular, I wish I could bring that off. It's very much the sort of thing I like to do.
Yeah, it's that whole idea of anxiety as and release, which is usually what comedy
Mm.
does. It builds some tension up, and then you relieve it, and we
Yes,
laugh. But
much like horror,
um,
actually. And of course, there are other things. I mean, both depend on a sense of timing, I think, crucially for their effects.
absolutely, and also sort of what do you call them? When you refer back to things which you've seeded very early on in the narratives,
Yes.
that sense of
Oh,
recognition.
absolutely. Yes. Yes.
And also the idea of incongruity,
Yes.
seeing things in the wrong places.
Mm.
Comically, it is similar to the uncanny in horror, where you see something you think of as relatively innocent, but in a context which makes it
Yes, it
sinister.
is. And I mean, sometimes you could actually compare different instances. I mean, there's Lunch at the Gotham Cafe short story by Stephen King, in which basically the protagonist meets his soon-to-be ex-wife and her lawyer to thrash out terms for the divorce over lunch. And I think it is the chef, or it may be a waiter, it's one of the two, who goes mad and becomes homicidal. Now, it's the dirty spoon scene from Monty Python, isn't it, as well? It's a different version, but Steve makes it terrifying. They make it comical. And it just shows, you turn it one way, it's one thing, turn it the other, it's another. And in many cases, it's both. I mean, something like, say, The League of Gentlemen, or some of the episodes of Inside Number Nine. And it seems to me that you can't distinguish horror and comedy within those in quite a few instances.
Another sort of thread of your interest, which sort of connects the books with cinema, is your sort of passion for H.P. Lovecraft and the Cthulhu
Hmm.
mythos, which you've explored in your own fiction as
Sure.
well. And I believe, sorry, stop, correct me if I'm wrong, but you had a collaboration with August Deleuve, is
No,
that
not a
correct?
collaboration, but he was a mentor. He was my first editor when I was
Right.
15. And he sent me a very long, detailed letter of, what needed to be done to improve what I'd sent him. And by gum, he was very, very, very right. But it's interesting that, that's what Lovecraft did to Derleth as a correspondent, and to Robert Bloch for that matter. So basically, the thing is passed from generation to generation. To a certain extent, I've tried to do it myself as an editor. So it goes on.
That's amazing. I talked to Alan Dean Foster for this podcast, and he told me that he was talking to Robert Bloch once, and they were talking about H.P. Lovecraft's
Mm.
story, and he pronounced a word from the mythos, and Robert Bloch said, "No, no, no, it's pronounced."
Uh-huh.
I can't remember what the exact
Uh-huh.
word was,
Uh-huh.
but it's Cthulhu or what, and it's pronounced
Mm.
this way, and Alan Dean Foster, a bit annoyed, said, "Well, it's fictional, so how could
Uh-huh.
you know?" And he was like, "Well, because H.P. Lovecraft
Yeah,
told
well,
me."
yes, that's right. He did tell folk how to pronounce these outlandish alien names. True enough.
Cinema has had a strange relationship, I think, with H.P.
Mm.
Lovecraft.
Mm.
Kind of not necessarily able to directly transpose or adapt his books, but at the same time, maybe do adaptations in everything but name. I
Yes.
mean, I'm thinking of John Carpenter's The Thing, for
Yes.
instance.
Yes.
I don't see the point in making the Mountains of Madness while we've got
Mm.
The Thing.
Mm. Mm.
It's the best
It's very
version of
good.
it.
It's very good, certainly. I mean, I'm quite fond of the Haunted Palace, the Corman. I mean, it's really the case of Charles Dexter Ward, and with the title imposed by the studio. I do actually like that. Let's see if we can pronounce him correctly. The Call of Cthulhu, maybe, or maybe we'll do him. If that's the pronunciation, I'm not sure. But done by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society as well, an amateur in the best sense of amateur. A film made by people who
Mm.
love the material, and they actually did it in the style of a silent film from the year of publication of the story, and it's really pretty good. And there are other instances like this. For me, I mean, you say The Thing, and I would agree with you certainly. For me, possibly the most Lovecraftian films that has nothing directly to do with Lovecraft, in the sense of the elusiveness of it, and the documentary approach which Lovecraft championed for horror fiction, supernatural horror fiction in particular. Is the Blair Witch Project, and I actually think that's
Oh,
very much a Lovecraft movie for me anyway, and also I
I
found it
re
terrifying.
I was just about to say I watched it once in Liverpool, on the London Road.
Odeon.
Well,
Mm,
Odeon, yeah,
mm.
exactly. When it came out, in an empty cinema, except at one point during the screening, the back door opened, and I kid you not, a woman with very large hair stood there for a few minutes and then left. And I thought, is this some gimmick the cinema are doing? Because it is it. But I watched it recently, like a couple of months
Mhm.
ago, and it stands up so well. It's so well
I
done, that
think so.
film.
Yes, I think so.
And strangely underrated,
Yeah.
even though it's hugely
Yeah,
rated,
yeah,
if that's possible.
yeah, yeah. Well, a lot of people loathe it, of course, but no, I certainly champion it.
Yeah, I can see what you mean by Lovecraftian as well, because it has that. There's a mythos,
Mm.
there is a
Yes,
legend, there is and that proves, proves to be true.
yes. And there's a sense
In
of something larger than the narrative that we never quite get told, but it's a sense of it there.
Are there any other sort of people who are working in horror cinema that I mean, we mentioned Ari Aster, and of course, his first couple of films were very starkly sort of lodged
Mm,
in
mm,
horror
mm.
cinema. Are
Yes,
there any other sort of filmmakers who you look to and think they're really doing some great work in horror?
David Lynch. David,
Right,
David
right.
Lynch is the only filmmaker whose work frequently terrifies me on an absolute visceral level. I mean, there have been quite a number of instances, particularly the first time round, when I've watched a Lynch film. Lost Highway is always the one I cite, and pretty well the entire first half hour of that film. I sit there in a state of constant panic, thinking, can I quite cope with much more of this if he goes on much longer with it? But the Passengers of Fire walk with me. There's Mulholland Drive with the presence behind the diner and so forth. Where he just takes me to the absolute edge, and I've sort of concluded this, that whereas Hitchcock would use every element of cinema to convey, well, not merely suspense, much more than that, but suspense to some extent. That Lynch does the same with the uncanny and inexplicable and enigmatic. And of course, I mustn't forget to mention the final series of Twin Peaks, some of which again goes to that absolute edge for me. So yeah, Lynch for sure. And sadly, I can't for the moment bring the name to mind, but whoever made Speak No Evil, I believe Danish film, I think, which just left Jenny, my wife, and me completely shaken at the end, just speechless, basically. Now I see it's just been remade in an English language version, and begin with, I thought, oh dear, this is going to be a travesty. But when I realised that it's by the chap who made Eden Lake, maybe not. Maybe he'll go all the way with it too.
The name of the director is Christian Tadfrup.
Okay.
I claim no superior knowledge. I used a moment to quickly address Dr. Google.
Well done. Well done.
Yeah, that is I mean, I think this is where Lovecraft comes in for me, and that idea of what universe you live in. Whereas Edgar Allan Poe's sort of branch of horror seems to be moral.
Yeah.
People do bad things and bad things happen to them as a consequence. Yeah. H.P. Lovecraft is people don't do bad things. Maybe they just go to the wrong place and the universe doesn't care about them.
That's right.
And I think Speak No Evil is a little bit like that. It's like these people aren't bad. Yeah. In fact, they're trapped by their own ideas of civilization and politeness, not by any,
Well, yes, that's what this is. I certainly see that. I mean, some people are absolutely, hostile to the film and to the behavior of the characters. But I kept, as I sat there, I kept thinking, I'd probably do that too. I wouldn't intervene. I wouldn't, take the chance, switch the keys from the ignition. And that's possibly the most terrifying thing of all.
I remember the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, the David Fincher version, and how Stellan Skarsgård at a certain point, spoiler alert, explains to Daniel Craig, you knew I was the person, and when I invited you in, you had an opportunity to just turn and run, but you were too polite. You couldn't break that social thing, and now I've got you.
Yes, that's right. Well, I'll tell you what this takes me back to. I mean, we're talking at a slightly lower level here, but nevertheless, it has some merit. A movie from the 70s, which you may know, called Count Yorga Vampire, which brings a vampire to what was then, modern, present-day Los Angeles. And the one scene I've always remembered very much like, in which the equivalent of Van Helsing and his minions, or his helpers, try to go to the vampire's house, and their idea is keep him up until dawn and see what happens then, and then we'll know he is a vampire. And they can't quite do it. The politeness gets the better of them. They think, what are we doing keeping this poor guy up all night? And they shamefacedly leave instead.
The flesh is too weak. It's like the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yes.
And one of the other, you've had several of your books adapted into film. How have your experiences of that
pretty
been?
good. I mean, I didn't, I had no hand in it. I just, sell the rights, and because I personally, I'd rather somebody who knew what they were doing did it rather than have me getting in the way. I think of the three, it's Los Sin Nombre. It's probably my favourite. Jaume Balaguero wrote and directed, and he did something pretty radical because the novel, The Nameless, has a strong supernatural element. He threw out all the supernatural. What he said he wanted to keep was the dread, and he certainly does that for me. And the fact they shot the finale in an abandoned motel outside Barcelona, and apparently filmed in there for a week and stayed there, and found the place itself pretty daunting. It seemed to me to come across on the screen, and very much does, the sort of thing that I was trying to do. And actually, let me say this also, his ending is bleaker than mine, so more power to him.
Brilliant. Yeah, I mean that must be really inspiring to see to see another artist take something you've created and transform it into another medium, another form of artwork.
Very much so, very much so.
Yeah. Have you got any other works that you sort of think, oh, I wish I'd like them to buy the rights to all my books,
yes.
but I wish someone would I wish someone would go ahead and make this. I can see this as being a great movie.
Well, it's been a great movie, but I think the Good of the Dark. I would like somebody sufficiently radical in terms of filmmaking to have a shot at that, because I think it would need to be done as a sort of protracted nightmare in a way. I actually think the trilogy, of which I'm fond, my only trilogy, always will be my only trilogy. It took 3 years to write, but I'm glad I did it. But I mean, that I think could possibly be a series, not necessarily of films, but I don't know, a cable television series, because I think that is pretty substantial. So those two kind of occur to me, maybe.
Well, Dr. Netflix is no doubt listening.
Let's hope.
The last question I'd like to ask Ramsey is, we always try to encourage people to recommend film books as part of just getting people to read as many film books as possible. Yes. Do you have any film books that you'd like to recommend our listeners?
Just about anything by Robin Wood, I'd say, actually.
Right.
I mean, his book on Hitchcock's films, I still think is, it was a revelation to me when I read the first edition back in my, I suppose, late teens, it would have been. I think it completely revolutionized how I looked at films. Basically, I'd already been reading movie and I think probably the English language cahier du cinéma, but Wood took this and raised it to an even higher level. I think it's an extraordinary book. But his books generally are film criticism. I think the thing is possibly read them in order, because there is a strong kind of autobiographical element to them, which sometimes comes over very overtly, but there's very much a sense of development. Now, ultimately, you'll find him disagreeing with what he said earlier on, which is, but the fact was he would always say he felt he'd not got it previously. Now, whether you agree with all his ramifications is perhaps another matter, but he's never less than stimulating. So, Robin Wood has my top recommendation. Only wish he was still with us.
I think that's so interesting. I really love hearing of critics who change their minds. I mean, I know Roger Ebert used to very famously write second reviews after after a few months had passed, if he changed his mind about a film. Because as a film critic, as someone who's written hundreds and hundreds of reviews in my lifetime, I'm always worried about. The one thing that I suspect most about my critical acumen is consistency, because I just don't feel. I feel different every time I watch a film.
Oh yes, so yes, I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to hear. So a better critic than me has had a similar. Yeah, I prefer being flexible than being coherent.
Yeah, I think that's right.
One thing as well that came out of your book, Ramsey's Rambles, just going back to that briefly, is how much of a cinephile community there was in Liverpool at that stage when you were growing up. There was something to really connect to.
Yes, very much so. There were film societies, several of them actually. I mean, there was one at the Blue Coat, the Merseyside Film Institute, and that had been going already for, I think, some decades, I think. And that was where I caught up with a great deal of foreign language stuff. I mean, the occasional cinema would give it a go, and occasionally they'd managed to carry on for a little while. But it was the MFI that was always was reliable reliable. Although there were problems. I mean, 16 millimeter sometimes had some drawbacks. For instance, Vertigo was only ever available in 60 millimeter in black and white, which is,
Oh
but
no.
on the other hand, there's still so much to Vertigo even in black and white, and that was how I first saw it. But later on, obviously, color added so much. And I must say this, that the recent ultra high definition release, I mean, I just thought that was absolutely jaw dropping, and again saw things I'd never seen before. And I think that really is extraordinary, that transfer.
I agree that I love some of these new restorations, and I love watching them. I saw The Shining on the big
Mm,
screen
mm.
restored, and I realized for the first time that it was actually
Yes.
scary. It had never struck me as scary before. It had always been sort of, I don't know
Mm,
why, too
mm, mm.
familiar. Jack Nicholson's performance, and then I watched on the big screen, and I was trapped in that room, and I
Mm,
thought,
mm.
oh no, this is what it's
Yes,
like.
yes.
That's a theatrical experience. You need
Yeah,
that.
that's right.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you so much, Ramsey, for joining me, and thank you so much for the books. I'm definitely going to explore the Three Stooges or the Six Stooges and Counting. I mean, I think we should actually explain that title briefly as well for people who don't know.
Yes, well, okay. Actually, that was one of the things that began to fascinate me about them, which is why I decided to explore them in more depth. But it's the most inchoate comedy team I can think of in Hollywood. I mean, they started off as Moe, Larry, and Shemp, and then Shemp in the early 30s goes off and finds himself a separate career. So Curly, the younger brother, comes in and he takes over. He is incapacitated in the mid 40s, so Shemp comes back. So we now got four Stooges, not all together at the same time, although they do very briefly appear together in one film. And then once Shemp dies, we get first of all Joe Besser, who's a very curious and doesn't adapt his comic persona to any great extent to the team at all. And there's a real softening of the whole, the base of the Stooges. And then at the very last, Joe DeRita comes in after Besser, and he attempts to be a sort of surrogate of Curly, and he's okay. He has his own comic persona, but he adapts in the way that Besser does not. So by this side, you've actually got Six Stooges, but since we had Joe Palmer as the fake Shemp, there's yet another Stooge, so at least seven, and that's not counting innumerable stunt people who took some of the falls, although not all. Famously, you can still see on screen Moe in an early film falling through a table that Curly has sawn through, and apparently Moe broke two ribs but carried on with the take and didn't scream until the camera had stopped rolling.
And there was like a recent film, or recent, I mean, in the last 15 years,
Mm.
there was a sort of recent attempt to I'm not sure how
By
successful it
the
was, but
Farrelly brothers. Yes, yes.
yes,
I
yeah.
think that's probably their best and funniest film, actually. I mean,
Oh
it's
my gosh.
very much a film by people who love the Stooges.
Mm.
There is one issue that the Stooges were actually pretty short, about 5 foot each. The guy who plays Curly in the Farrelly Brothers film is several inches taller than the other two, but I, for one at least, got used to that very quickly. And it's a film that it's a bit like what we were talking earlier about, anticipation. That there are things in there that that Stooges fans would miss if they were not in there as tributes. But the film always does a bit of a variation on them. It never simply replicates them. And it actually is very funny and very inventive. And I watched that several times for the purposes of the book, but actually, by the end of it, I was just watching it for pleasure. And I certainly recommend that to anybody who finds that they like the Stooges, for sure.
I remember when the original casting of that film was
Mm.
announced, it was Sean Penn and Benicio del Toro
Yes.
were going to be in it. I don't remember who the third,
Uh,
maybe Jim
yeah, I
Carrey,
think that
but it
sounds
was,
possible. Yes, yes.
yeah, but it was a real sort of wow,
Mm.
what's that going to
Yes,
look
yes,
like?
absolutely, yes.
Alas. So So once more, thanks so much, Ramsey, and yeah, thank you for participating.
John, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.